First of all, thank you for inviting me to be here today to share a few words on this very important topic. It's truly an honor to be invited here. But to answer your question, there were many African American pioneers that inspired me over the years. But if I had to narrow it down to just one, at the top of that list would be Carter G. Woodson. Because you can't talk about Black History Month without talking about Carter G. Woodson. And as you know, he's the father of Black History Month. It started out in 1926 when he felt that African American history and traditions and contributions were suppressed and were not being taught in school. And he started what was known as Negro History Week. And over the years, he compiled as much information as he could about the contributions and history of African Americans. And each year he would celebrate Negro History Week during the month of February, because that was the month of the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, who he thought had a large impact on African American society. So that's the reason he chose February. In the 1970s, President Johnson turned that into Black History Month. That's one of the reasons that he inspired me. But the main reason that he inspired me is because he's the embodiment of success through education and perseverance. Because if you read his story, he's one generation removed from slavery. His parents were former slaves. His parents were illiterate, couldn't read and write, just like many of his people in the community. They couldn't read and write. His family were hard-working people, working every day to put food on the table, to put clothes on the family's backs and put a roof over their heads. But Carter G. Woodson had a thirst for knowledge, and he had a thirst for education, and he decided that he wanted to pursue something other than the hard labor life that his parents were going through. So he wanted to be educated, but he would have to, on occasions, put his education aside to go to work, to do manual labor, to help his family put food on the tables and a roof over their heads. So he would put his dreams aside temporarily, but then he would go back and go to school. He eventually finished high school, he finished college, and he went on to obtain his PhD from Harvard University. And that's an incredible feat in and of itself, being one generation removed from slavery, that he obtained his PhD from Harvard University. And he continued on with his career as an educator. He was a very successful educator. He became a very successful writer, and he was the father of Black History Month, and as the rest, as they say, is Black History. And Black History Month is very important for all cultures. Starting with African Americans, it's important to know your history, and it's important to know that African Americans had a contribution to the foundation of this country. And one of the reasons that I chose Carter G. Woodson, because he felt that African American history and contributions were suppressed and not being taught in schools. And when I was coming up and going through schools in the 70s and the 80s, back then we were taught about Africans who were captured in slavery, brought to this country, that were enslaved. We learned a little bit about Frederick Douglass, we learned a little bit about Harriet Tubman, and then Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. We learned about Jim Crow, civil rights, and then it was Martin Luther King, and he died trying to find justice for all people. We didn't learn a lot about the contributions of many African Americans. So I think it's important for African Americans to know the history. There's an old cliche that if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. But if you don't know your history, you're doomed for it to die, and nobody will know if you don't teach your children. So it's real important for African Americans to learn their history. It's also important for people of other cultures to learn African American history, because I believe that it removes that divide between cultures, it removes the divide between races. And when you have people who don't know other people's backgrounds, you don't know other people's history and traditions, there's that division among races and this division among cultures. And I truly believe that when people learn to appreciate the history of others, and you learn to appreciate the culture of others and the traditions and the significant contributions of African Americans, then you learn to appreciate African Americans more. And when we have Black History Month and you have people who highlight and showcase the contributions of African Americans in our history, then you learn that many of the things that we use every day and things that we take for granted are contributions from African Americans. You learn everybody has a cell phone, and you learn that it was an African American's contribution that led to cell phones. You know, on a hot day, you want air conditioning in a building. It was an African American that invented air conditioning. If you want a cold glass of water, it's an African American that invented refrigeration. You know, coming up, I wish you had an elevator in this building because it was an African American that invented the elevator. So it's just so many contributions that African Americans have had over the history of this country that are just not showcased a lot. And when people of other cultures realize that, then it kind of gets rid of the divide, and you understand people more and you learn about people more, and I think you appreciate people more. You need to know what was going on in the past here in Terrebonne Parish. And the parish is getting better, it's improving. We're not perfect, just like any other parish or county or city in this country, but we're improving the relationships between the different cultures, and it's highlighted through Black History Month and when you learn the history. And I'm so glad that the parish has taken upon itself to have programs during the month of February that showcase and highlight Black History Month so that other people in the parish can learn about the contributions and learn about the traditions and the history of African Americans. And I truly believe that when people learn about each other, we all have to live on this planet together. We all have to live in this community together. And I truly believe that when we learn about each other, we learn more. We learn that there aren't very many differences between the different races and different cultures, and it makes a better place to live. And I think it makes everybody more rounded people in general. My name is Juan Pickett. I'm a district court judge in Terrebonne Parish Division C. I was sworn in December of 2014. I'm a judge of general jurisdiction, which means I handle criminal, civil, and child in need of care cases.